On a lovely sunny day at the beginning of spring, I cannot think of a better story than this charming tale, The Conceited Lamb, written by Noel Barr, with lovingly painted illustrations by P.B. Hicking. My copy of the book was printed in England in 1954 and was part of the Ladybird 497 series. I do hope you enjoy listening to this, and please give it a like. Once upon a time, there was a little white lamb. He lived in a farmhouse with the farmer and his wife and their little daughter. The farm was a large one, for the farmer owned fields of growing corn and an orchard of apple, cherry and plum and pear trees. There were also meadows and pastures in which he kept many animals. There were horses to draw the plough and the carts, and cows to give milk to be made into butter and cheese. There were pigs in the pigsty and ducks on the pond, cocks and hens with their chickens scratched in the farmyard, and turkeys strutted about in the field close by. Of course, there was a cat, a tabby one, and a big black and white dog called Bob, who lived in a kennel close to the big front door of the house. It is not often that a lamb lives inside a house, but this one had lived there since he was quite tiny, because he had no mother to look after him. The farmer's little daughter took great care of him. She fed him, washed him with soap and water, combed his curly white wool, and tied a pink satin ribbon around his neck. And as he was quite white all over, she called him Snowball. Now Snowball was really a very nice little lamb, but because his mistress made his woolly coat look so beautiful and had given him a pink satin ribbon to wear round his neck, and because he was allowed to sleep in a basket by the side of her bed, he became so proud of himself and put on such grand airs that he made himself a nuisance to everyone in the farmyard. He would skip into the stable, stick his nose into the air and say to the two brown horses, how sad. Brown is a dull colour, isn't it? Don't you wish you had a beautiful white coat like mine? The horses usually took very little notice of what he said, for they felt it was beneath them to notice his silly remarks. But sometimes they smiled at one another and tossed their heads, thinking how very odd they would look if they were covered with thick white wool. Sometimes Snowball would push open the door of the cowshed, where the cows were waiting to be milked, and say as he looked at their smooth shining backs, "Well, well, I am sorry for you. Nobody would bother to comb you. Don't you all wish you had a beautiful white coat like mine?" The cows always pretended not to hear. They just went on eating slowly, swishing their long tails, but they always turned their heads and gave a low moo when they heard the farmer and his men rattling their pails as they carried them into the cowshed. They knew that Snowball would be turned out of their shed when the milking began. He would visit the pigs in the pigsty and would try to peep over the low wall and say, "Bristles? Dear, dear, they must be most uncomfortable. Don't you wish you had a beautiful white coat like mine?" The pigs were not as patient as the cows. They would run out of their little house grunting and squealing, and would stand on their hind legs with their front feet on the gates so that they could see Snowball. They would shake their ears and wriggle their curly tails while they told him, in the worst language they could think of, exactly what they thought of his rude manners. Snowball told the cocks and the hens that their feathers were no good as they were always dropping out. He told the farmyard cat that she would look much more handsome if her fur was white and curly, and he chased the chickens all over the yard just because he wanted to show them what a fine fellow he was. He advised the turkeys to curl their children's feathers, saying it would be a great improvement. He laughed at the ducks' sleek backs, and all the animals heard him say, "Don't you wish you had a beautiful white coat like mine?" so often that they were heartily sick of him. But when he began to be really impudent as well, calling out, "Ya old spotty coats" to the cows as they crossed the farmyard, and "Hello scrubbing brushes" to the pigs, they all began to think that it was quite time they taught Snowball a lesson. But as it happened, he taught himself one instead. Outside the farmhouse there was a little garden. Flowers grew in it, and there was a stretch of smooth green grass. Sometimes in the summer the farmer's family had tea there, and very often the farmer's little girl played in it with her friends. They carried out their dolls and their paint boxes and their books. It was here that the farmer's wife hung out her washing, spreading the linen on the grass to bleach. Round this garden was a low wall with a broad, flat top, and Snowball had a way of scrambling onto it, shouting some rude remark to the animals in the farmyard, and then jumping down and running into the house out of their way. Now it happened one sunny afternoon that the farmer's wife decided to dye her winter coat so that it would be ready for her when the cold weather came. She put a little shawl over her shoulders and went down to the grocer's shop. There she bought a packet of black dye and some new buttons. When she got home again, she went up to the attic and took her coat out of the big cupboard where all the winter clothes were stored. And then she went to the kitchen again and put a large kettle of water on to boil. She took some clothes pegs out of a drawer and went to the garden to put up the clothesline. Everything was now ready, so she mixed the dye and very carefully dyed the coat. When the farmer's wife had finished, she carried out a large wooden tub and, lifting the wet coat out, hung it on the clothesline where it dripped, leaving little black pools on the grass. Just as she was putting on the last clothes peg, she heard the farmer calling, and away she hurried, leaving the tub behind her. Now this tub was still half full of dye, and besides that, it was very near the wall. Snowball, with a new pink satin ribbon tied in a bigger bow than usual, had been spending his afternoon running about the farmyard, making a nuisance of himself. He teased the coloured cock until it chased him away. He annoyed Bob, who threatened to bite him, and he shouted impertinent remarks to the ducks on the pond. He chased the tabby cat, was impudent to the pigs in their sty, and stood at the gate of the field being rude to the cows. Then he skipped across the yard and looked into the stable. Dolly and Dobbin were there waiting to be harnessed to the farm cart before going down to the hayfield. Snowball began slyly pulling their tails and rushing away. After that he said silly things on purpose to make them angry, calling them out in a very cheeky way. Dolly and Dobbin bore it all very patiently for some time, but at last Dolly looked over into Dobbin's stall and whispered to him, and Dobbin nodded his head knowingly. The next time that Snowball went near to Dobbin's hind hoof, he was sent spinning through the stable doorway. He wasn't hurt because it had been more of a push than a kick, but he rolled over and over, head over heels, into the farmyard. Snowball was taken very much by surprise, but after a minute he picked himself up and, feeling very angry, jumped onto the wall and shouted, "You big mud-coloured thing, don't you wish—" And then there was a splash, for he had turned and jumped straight into the tub of black dye. Oh, what a different little lamb it was that climbed slowly out of the tub and stood dripping on the grass. He was quite black from head to foot, and round his neck there hung a bedraggled black ribbon. He stood quite still, wondering what had happened to him. The 2 horses in the stable had watched it all through the open door, and they laughed and laughed until all the harness in the stable rang like little bells. Then, when the cows heard the horses laughing, they came running up to see what was the matter. And when they saw Snowball, they laughed and they laughed until tears ran out of their large eyes. The ducks on the edge of the pond also laughed until they fell backwards into the water, and the pigs rolled over and over in the sty, laughing until they could laugh no more. The farmer and his wife, hearing all the noise, ran out to see what it was all about, and when they saw Snowball, they laughed and they laughed until they had to sit down and mop their faces and dry their eyes. The only one who didn't laugh was Snowball's little mistress, and she scolded him for being so careless and ran off to get soap and hot water ready. Snowball stood in the middle of a black pool and stared at them all, and then, without knowing it, he did the very best thing he could have done. He laughed and he laughed and he laughed and he laughed until he shook so much that he looked like a little black fountain. The dye was poured away, and the farmer, still laughing, lifted Snowball into the tub and carried him through the garden and into a big kitchen. There he was put into a large bath of warm water. The farmer's little girl in a blue apron brought a thick towel and set to work. She rubbed and she scrubbed and she soaped and she rinsed and then she soaped again. She tried this and she tried that, and then left her mother hard at it while she ran down the road to the chemist's shop to see whether he could tell her of anything that would remove the black dye from the white wool. He gave her 1 or 2 things to try, but they made no difference at all, and in the end she had to give up. Snowball's beautiful white coat was gone forever. He was now only a little grey lamb, rather patchy. At first he minded rather much, but the other animals were so kind to him, and he found an ordinary grey coat so convenient, because he hadn't always to be thinking of taking care of it. And after a little time he didn't mind at all. He became the same merry little fellow he had been before, with one exception. He sometimes teased a little, but only in a kindly way. And if he ever began to boast about anything even a little bit, someone in the farmyard would say quite softly, "Don't you wish you had a beautiful white coat like mine?" And he would stop at once.